It feels like war is just this constant shadow in our world, always in the headlines, always in the history books. But if we really want to understand why we fight, we have to look past the battlefield. We need to dig deeper into the very structure of power itself.
All right, here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll build a simple framework for what power even is. Then, we'll see what happens when that power breaks down and how that leads to conflict. We'll take a quick look back through history, see how this plays out on the modern battlefield, and then, finally, we'll ask, is there a way to build a lasting peace?
So, first things first, before we can even get into why we fight, we have to ask a much more basic question. What exactly is power? We know it's about influencing people, but how does it actually work?
And lucky for us, a political scientist named Michael Mann came up with a really useful way to think about this. He broke social power down into 4 distinct types. And honestly, these 4 categories are the toolkit we're going to use to understand everything else.
So let's break down these 4 sources of control, one by one, to really see how they shape our world.
Okay, first up, political power. Now, this isn't just about politicians and voting. At its very core, it taps into our fundamental need to belong to a group. We agree to let someone lead because we believe that together we can do things, like protect our community or build a city that we could never ever do on our own.
Next, we have economic power. You can think of this as the power of the carrot. It's all about getting people to do things by offering them a reward, right? A paycheck for your work is the classic example. But here's where it gets kind of tricky. If your only other option is to starve, is accepting that wage really a free choice, or is it something else?
And then you've got the total opposite, military power. If economic power is the carrot, this is the stick. It's the most direct, most blunt form of power there is. It's based on organized force, and it works because, well, we all have a pretty basic desire to not get hurt.
And finally, we have ideological power. Now this might be the most subtle, but you could argue it's the most powerful of them all. It's the ability to shape what people believe, their values, their sense of what's right and wrong. It doesn't just control what people do, it controls the lens they use to see the entire world. It defines what's worth living for and what's worth fighting for.
So, you see, conflict isn't just about armies. It's about when these deep systems of power get out of whack. Now that we have these 4 building blocks, we can ask the really important question, what happens when they break down? What happens when they're used to divide people instead of uniting them? Well, that's where you find the real roots of conflict.
And researchers at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, or SIPRI, have studied this a lot. And they've found that big, long-lasting conflicts almost never just pop up out of nowhere. They grow out of very specific failures in how a country is run, failures in how power is used.
The first big reason is something called weak state capacity. That's really just a way of saying the government is broken. It can't or won't do its most basic jobs, like providing security or justice. This creates a huge power vacuum, and violence just loves a vacuum.
And this is such a critical point, because it flips a common assumption on its head. We tend to think, oh, just go in and build a school or pave a road, and people will trust the government. But the research shows that's not really true. It turns out how things get done, if it's fair, if people have a say, that matters way more for building trust than the road itself.
The second huge cause is exclusion and marginalization. This is what happens when the whole system is rigged to help one group and hold another group down. It creates these deep, simmering resentments. And this isn't just theory. In Somalia, for example, researchers found that a key reason so many young people joined extremist groups was because they were completely shut out of the economy and political process.
And the third major cause is a lack of what you might call civic engagement. Basically, when people have no peaceful way to make their voices heard, no way to organize, to protest, to debate, their problems don't just magically disappear, they fester. And when talking doesn't work, fighting often becomes the next logical step.
Now, this whole push and pull between power and conflict, it's not new, not at all. In fact, we can see this exact same drama playing out across the entire sweep of human history.
I mean, think way back to ancient Rome. An emperor, like Caesar, he held all 4 types of power in his hands. He was the political boss, the top general, he controlled the economy, and they even worshipped him as a god. That's ideological power. But over centuries, we've seen this slow, fascinating trend of pulling those powers apart, leading to the ideal of a modern democracy where they're supposed to be held by separate people and institutions.
And this right here, this diagram shows you exactly what happens when that separation of powers completely collapses. You can see how military power has taken over everything else. It controls the political leader, it uses the police to control the people, and it sucks up all the economic resources to keep itself going. This is the basic recipe for a military dictatorship.
Okay, so we've got the framework, we've got the history. But how does any of this help us make sense of the wars we see happening right now all over the world today?
Well, one of the biggest problems today is something historians call the short war delusion. It's this incredibly tempting myth that you can just win a war with one quick knockout punch. But the reality is, modern wars aren't just fought by armies anymore. They involve whole societies. That makes them incredibly hard to stop, and they almost always drag on into these brutal, grinding wars of attrition.
And that leads to another really powerful way of thinking about this. What if war is basically just a negotiation that has gone catastrophically wrong? Think about it. Both sides are bluffing, they're hiding how strong they really are or how long they're willing to fight. War, in this view, is the terrifying, violent process of calling each other's bluff to find out what the truth really is.
On top of all that, the very nature of war itself is changing. The old wars we think of from the 20th century were usually nations fighting nations. The lines were pretty clear. But today's new wars, they are messy. You've got countries fighting terrorist groups, warlords, and private militias. Targeting civilians is often part of the strategy, and the battlefield now includes everything from cyber attacks to social media.
So yeah, this is a pretty complex and kind of grim picture, isn't it? Is there any way out? Well, that research from SIPRI suggests there is, but it's going to require a totally new way of working, one that gets at those deep root causes we talked about earlier.
And it's not a simple fix. It means that the people on the ground trying to build peace have to go way beyond just technical solutions. They need to understand the psychology of the conflict. It means researchers need to get much better at figuring out what actually works. And it means the people funding these efforts need to be more patient and more flexible because this stuff takes time.
And all of this leaves us with one final provocative thought. War isn't a force of nature, right? It's not like an earthquake or a hurricane. It's something humans invented. It's a product of the systems and choices that we have made. And if we were the ones who invented it, doesn't that also mean that we have the power to make different choices, to change those systems, and maybe, one day, to uninvent it for good?